The little girl came out of the dust like a ghost, barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, her hair tangled and stiff with dried tears, running straight toward the line of roaring motorcycles that had stopped beneath the dying sun, and every instinct in the bikers told them to raise guards, tighten grips, and prepare for trouble, because nothing good ever came running toward men like them in the middle of nowhere. Yet something in the way she ran, stumbling, desperate, clutching a small dirty scarf in her fist, made even the engines seem to lower their growl, and when she finally reached them she didn't ask who they were or what they did, she only collapsed to her knees in the dirt and screamed words that froze every hardened heart present. Please, they hung my mom on a tree, she's still breathing, please save her. The desert road stretched empty behind her, heat wavering off cracked earth, vultures circling far above as if already invited, and for a long moment nobody moved, not the towering men in leather and patches, not the little girl sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, because every one of them understood what saving someone like that meant: blood, consequences, attention, and men like them survived by avoiding all three. Yet the girl lifted her face then, eyes red and wide and terrified, and looked straight at the one they called Graves, the oldest among them, the man whose beard had gone gray without ever going soft, and she whispered, they said nobody would come, they said she'd die slow, and something ancient and ugly stirred in Graves' chest, something he had buried a long time ago under miles of road and bad decisions. Out he knelt despite himself, boots sinking into dirt, and asked her name, and when she said Lena, voice shaking but stubborn, he felt the weight of every child. He'd failed in a life that never made room for innocence, and when he asked where this tree was, the girl pointed toward the low hills where the land dipped into a dried riverbed, and said men from the nearby settlement did it because her mother wouldn't belong to one of them, and that word, belong, made the air turn sharp, because every man standing there knew what it meant when spoken by the wrong kind of people. Engines shut off one by one, the sudden silence loud enough to feel, and some of the bikers exchanged looks, subtle but clear, the kind of looks that said this is not our fight, while others already checked weapons without speaking, and Graves stood slowly, his knees complaining, and said only, mount up, and no one questioned him, because when Graves' voice went flat like that, arguments were already over. The ride into the riverbed felt longer than it was, the path narrowing, dust choking the air. Lena pressed against the fuel tank of Graves' bike, her small hands gripping leather like it was the only thing keeping her world from falling apart, and she kept whispering, please hurry, over and over, until the trees finally appeared, crooked, skeletal things clinging to dry soil, and then they saw it. Her mother hung there, wrists tied above her head with rope cut so tight it had bitten into flesh, feet barely touching the ground, head slumped forward, hair matted with blood and dirt, and for one breathless moment everyone thought they were too late, until Graves saw the faint rise of her chest, shallow and stubborn, refusing to quit. What happened next was fast and quiet and terrifying in its efficiency. Knives flashed. Rope snapped. Her body dropped and was caught before it hit the ground. Someone laid a jacket beneath her head. Someone else checked her pulse. Someone swore softly, not in anger, but in something like prayer. Lena screamed once and then went silent, staring as if afraid blinking would make it disappear. Graves crouched again, this time beside the woman, and he'd seen a lot of almost dead in his life, but there was something cruelly deliberate about this one, something meant to teach a lesson, and when the woman's eyes fluttered open and she whispered her daughter's name, Graves closed his eyes for half a second, because now it wasn't just a rescue, it was a promise. They moved fast, retreating before anyone could come back, loading mother and child onto bikes, riding toward an abandoned mining shack they knew from years of running back roads, a place hidden from view, where first aid kits came out and hands that had broken bones now worked gently, binding wounds, giving water drop by drop, while Lena sat pressed against her mother's side, refusing to let go, her small fingers clutching fabric like anchors. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in blood-orange streaks, wordless understanding settled among the bikers. Whoever had done this wouldn't stop. Men like that never did. And now they had witnesses. Now they had survivors. And now, whether they wanted it or not, they were part of the story. Graves stepped outside the shack, lighting a cigarette. He didn't even smoke anymore. Staring at the darkening hills, knowing full well what helping meant next, and for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel empty, it felt heavy. Inside, Lena looked up at one of the bikers and asked in a small, broken voice, are they going to come back? And the man hesitated before answering, because lies were easy, but the truth mattered more, and before he could speak, Graves walked back in and said, if they do, they'll regret it. And that was the moment everything changed. Morning came slow and heavy, like the world itself didn't want to wake up and face what had been done, and the abandoned mining shack sat quiet under a pale sky while the woman slept inside, breathing shallow but steady, wrapped in borrowed jackets and guarded by men no one in the nearby settlement would ever dare confront openly, though they didn't know that yet. Lena hadn't slept at all. She sat near the doorway, knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on the horizon as if watching for shadows that only she could see, and every time a bird cried or wind shifted through dead grass, her shoulders tightened. Because fear doesn't leave just because danger pauses. Graves watched her from across the room, saying nothing, cleaning his hand slowly with a rag already stained too dark to matter, and he knew the look in her eyes because he'd worn it once himself, decades earlier, when he learned the world could take everything and still demand more. Outside, engines rumbled low as scouts returned one by one, faces grim, confirming what everyone already suspected: the settlement knew. Maybe not fully, maybe not yet, but rumors travel faster than justice in places like that, and a woman surviving what she wasn't supposed to survive made people nervous. By midday, the woman woke fully. Her name was Mara, and speaking hurt, breathing hurt, existing hurt, but the first thing she asked wasn't where she was or who these men were, it was whether Lena was safe. When Graves nodded, something broke loose behind her eyes, silent tears cutting clean lines down dirt-streaked cheeks, and she whispered, "They said she'd watch," and every man in the room went still, the weight of those words pressing down harder than fists ever could. Graves told her she wouldn't have to run anymore. He didn't promise peace. He didn't promise forgiveness. He promised something far more honest: protection. And in places like that, protection was power. The bikers moved before the settlement did. That was the difference between men who waited for permission and men who understood momentum. By late afternoon, they rode in openly, not fast, not aggressive, just present, engines echoing through narrow dirt streets lined with weather-beaten houses and eyes that slid away too quickly, and when they stopped in the center of town, silence followed like a held breath. Graves dismounted slowly, every step deliberate, and the patch on his back caught the sun just enough to make people swallow hard if they didn't ask who did it. They didn't need to. Fear tells the truth faster than mouths ever do. The men responsible stayed inside, watching through cracked doors and curtains, hoping intimidation would carry them through like it always had, but intimidation only works when no one stronger is willing to stand up to it. Graves spoke then, voice calm, almost gentle, and told the town they had a choice: to hand over the men who thought cruelty made them kings, or to live knowing what happens when injustice invites consequences. Someone shouted that it wasn't their problem. Another said outsiders had no right. Graves listened, nodded once, and said, "That little girl begged strangers because no one here helped. That made it everyone's problem." The standoff didn't last long. It never does when courage finally finds its footing. Doors opened. Fingers pointed. Names surfaced like rot under water. And when the men were dragged out, not beaten, not humiliated, just exposed, their confidence collapsed faster than their lies. They denied. They blamed. They laughed too loudly. Until Lena stepped forward, small and shaking but unbroken, and said, "You promised she'd die screaming," and the sound of the town breaking was louder than any engine. Justice didn't come from fists that day. It came from witnesses. From truth spoken out loud. From authority finally forced to look where it had been trained not to see. By the time officials arrived from outside jurisdictions, drawn by pressure and presence they couldn't ignore, the story was already too big to bury. Too many eyes. Too many voices. Too many bikers who didn't leave. When it was over, when the men were taken away and the town stood changed and uncertain, Graves knelt in front of Lena again. He told her monsters lose when people stop looking away. She asked if he was a monster too. He smiled sadly and said, "I try not to be anymore." As they rode out at sunset, the road stretched wide again, but it felt different now, less empty, like it carried meaning instead of escape, and Lena watched them disappear with something new in her chest, hope shaped like roaring engines and men who stopped when they didn't have to. Some stories don't end with the world fixed. They end with the world shifted. And sometimes, that's enough.